The scent of garlic and butter filled the kitchen as Leah carefully plated the final dish, her hands trembling slightly. Tonight was important, no, crucial. She had spent hours perfecting Ryan's favorite meal, seared steak with rosemary potatoes and sautéed asparagus. Everything had to be perfect. She needed Sylvia, her mother-in-law, to finally see her as the woman Ryan deserved. Leah glanced at her reflection in the kitchen window, fixing a stray curl before taking a deep breath. "You can do this." She adjusted her dress, a soft blue number Ryan had once said brought out her eyes, and walked into the dining room with a smile that masked her nerves. Ryan sat at the head of the table, looking relaxed, his sleeves rolled up as he sipped his whiskey. Across from him, Sylvia sat poised with her usual air of quiet judgment, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the table. Leah could feel the older woman's eyes on her as she set the plates down. "This looks lovely," Ryan said, flashing Leah a smile. Leah exhaled in relief. Maybe tonight would be different. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap as Sylvia picked up her fork, inspecting the meal as if searching for flaws. Leah held her breath as her mother-in-law took a bite. "Not bad," Sylvia finally said. "Though my late husband preferred his steak cooked properly, medium rare, not well done like this." Leah forced a smile, even as her stomach nodded. She had cooked it exactly how Ryan liked it. But before she could respond, Sylvia leaned toward her son, placing a delicate hand on his wrist. She whispered something in his ear. The change was instant. The warmth in Ryan's expression vanished, his face tightening as his jaw clenched. Leah's heart skipped a beat. "What?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. Sylvia simply sat back, her lips curling into the faintest smirk as she picked up her wine glass. Ryan turned to Leah, his eyes blazing with sudden fury. "Are you serious?" His voice rose, his grip tightening around his glass. Leah's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" Ryan shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. "Don't play dumb, Leah." His voice shook with anger, his face contorted in disbelief. Before she could form another word, his hand moved. The impact came swift and unexpected, the sharp sting spreading across Leah's cheek as she stumbled backward. A gasp caught in her throat as pain and shock collided in a sickening wave. The world tilted. For a moment, everything was still. Ryan's chest rose and fell heavily, his eyes wide with the realization of what he had done. Leah barely registered the sound of Sylvia setting her glass down, unbothered, as if she had seen this coming. A sharp nausea hit Leah's stomach, her hands instinctively flying to her midsection. And then, in the chaos, her purse slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents onto the floor. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as Ryan's gaze fell on the small white stick among the scattered items. A pregnancy test. Leah barely had time to react before Ryan bent down, picking it up with shaking fingers. He stared at it, his breathing shallow. Leah felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I was going to tell you tonight," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I wanted it to be special." Ryan's grip on the test tightened, his fingers trembling. His eyes flicked back to Leah, his expression torn between regret and devastation. His voice cracked. "You're pregnant." Leah nodded, biting her lip to keep the sobs from escaping. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. Ryan took a step back, his hand running through his hair. His face had drained of color. "What have I done?" The words weren't spoken aloud, but Leah saw them etched into his expression. Sylvia, however, remained indifferent. She sat there, watching, her expression unreadable. Leah felt the tremors in her hands as she placed them protectively over her stomach. She had spent so much time trying to win Sylvia's approval, trying to be the perfect wife for Ryan. But now, all of that seemed so distant, so meaningless. Her cheeks still burned. Her heart ached. And despite everything, all she could think about was the life growing inside her. Ryan's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes darkened with something Leah couldn't decipher: shame, anger, fear. She took a shaky breath, backing away toward the door. She couldn't stay here. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Ryan reached for her. Leah, wait. She flinched. The small movement shattered something between them. Ryan's hand fell to his side, and for the first time, true horror flickered across his face. But it was too late. The damage was done. Tears slipped down Leah's cheeks as she turned and walked out of the dining room. Each step felt heavier than the last, her vision blurred as she made her way to the front door. She didn't know where she was going, but one thing was certain. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. Instead, it had shattered everything. The first time Leah saw Ryan, he was standing at the counter of a small coffee shop, arguing with the barista about his order. She had been waiting behind him in line, quietly amused as he tried, and failed, to convince the young woman behind the register that he had, in fact, asked for oat milk, not almond. It's not a big deal, the barista had said with an exasperated smile, holding up the cup. It's still non-dairy. But it's not the same, Ryan had argued. I'm telling you, oat milk makes it smoother. Almond is too nutty, it overpowers the espresso. Leah had chuckled, drawing his attention. When he turned to face her, his frustration melted into an embarrassed grin. Am I being ridiculous? A little, she admitted, stepping forward. But I get it. The right milk-to-coffee ratio is important. Something passed between them in that moment, a spark, small but undeniable. Leah hadn't meant to flirt, but Ryan latched onto the exchange like a lifeline. He bought her coffee to make up for the scene he had caused, and they ended up sitting together, talking long after their drinks had gone cold. That was the start of everything. Leah used to love looking back on that day. She would tell the story to friends, always laughing at how stubborn Ryan had been over something so small. Back then, his persistence had been charming. Now, she wasn't so sure. The early days of their relationship had been effortless. They spent hours exploring the city together, trying new coffee shops, sneaking into late-night diners, and talking about their dreams. Ryan was ambitious. He had been working as a financial analyst, but wanted to start his own firm one day. Leah, a kindergarten teacher, adored the way he listened when she talked about her students, how he asked about her lesson plans and encouraged her ideas. They had been so in sync. So perfect. When Ryan proposed 2 years later, Leah didn't hesitate. The wedding was beautiful, small, and intimate, just the way they wanted it. She remembered the way he had looked at her when she walked down the aisle, like she was the only person in the world. She had never felt safer than in that moment, knowing that she was marrying the man she would build her future with. For a while, that future had been everything she dreamed. Then Sylvia moved in. Leah still remembered the day Ryan told her his mother was coming to stay with them. He had phrased it as a temporary arrangement, just until she gets back on her feet. Sylvia had been going through a tough divorce, and Ryan wanted to be there for her. Leah understood. She had always known that Ryan and his mother were close. What she hadn't expected was how quickly Sylvia's presence would change things. At first, it was little things, comments about Leah's cooking, the way she folded the laundry, the way she styled her hair. Ryan always liked his shirts ironed this way, Sylvia would say, taking over chores without asking. Are you sure that's the best way to season chicken? Leah tried not to let it bother her. She told herself Sylvia was just adjusting, that she was going through a difficult time. But the longer she stayed, the more critical she became. And worse, Ryan started listening. He would come home and casually mention things Sylvia had said. Mom thinks we should repaint the kitchen, he'd remark one evening, despite the fact that Leah had picked the color herself just a few months earlier. She says it's too dark in here. Or, Mom was just telling me how important it is to set boundaries in a marriage. She thinks we should talk about how often you go out with your friends. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, until it wasn't. Over time, Ryan's criticisms became sharper, his patience shorter. Leah would try to talk to him about her day, only to be met with disinterest. He started making offhand comments about her weight, about how often she spent money on unnecessary things. I just think we should be more practical, he had said when she came home with a new dress for a friend's wedding. Do you really need another one? It felt like everything she did was wrong. And every time she tried to bring it up, he would brush it off. You're overreacting. Mom didn't mean it that way. Can you just let it go? The worst part was that Leah had let it go. Over and over again. She convinced herself that things would get better, that Ryan would come back to her if she just tried a little harder. If she just loved him enough. But loving Ryan had started to feel like walking on glass. The breaking point had come when Leah's sister got married. It was supposed to be a happy day, a rare moment where Leah could be with her family and forget about the tension at home. Ryan had promised he would be there. He knew how important it was to her. But the morning of the wedding, he told her he couldn't make it. Mom's not feeling well, he had said, not even looking up from his phone. Leah had stood in the doorway, gripping the fabric of her dress. Ryan, you promised. I know, he said, finally glancing at her. But she needs me. Leah had felt something inside her crack. She always needs you, she whispered. Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. Leah, don't do this right now. But she wasn't the one doing this. She went to the wedding alone. That night, when she came home, she found Sylvia in the living room, smiling in that way that always made Leah's stomach turn. I hope you didn't take it personally, she had said, sipping her tea. Ryan just has a good heart. He can't stand seeing me upset. Leah had wanted to scream. Instead, she had gone upstairs and cried in the shower. Now, standing in the aftermath of Ryan's violent outburst, her cheeks still throbbing, Leah could see everything clearly. Her marriage hadn't fallen apart overnight. It had been unraveling for years, slowly, painfully. She had spent so much time trying to hold it together, but for what? For a man who put his mother's needs above his wife's? For a man who, tonight, had raised his hand against her? Leah touched her stomach, feeling the weight of her unborn child beneath her palm. She had been holding on to a love that no longer existed. And now, she wasn't sure if she could ever get it back. Leah sat on April's couch, knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them as if trying to hold herself together. The apartment was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows, stretching across the floor, marking the passage of time in a night that felt endless. Her cheek still burned from Ryan's slap. The shock of it clung to her skin, making it impossible to think of anything else. It wasn't just the pain. It was the sheer disbelief, the way her entire world had tilted on its axis in a single moment. She had known things were bad, but she had never thought Ryan would. A sharp, shuddering breath escaped her lips. Don't think about it. Not yet. April appeared from the kitchen, carrying a steaming mug of tea. Here, she said softly, setting it down on the coffee table. It's chamomile. Helps with the nerves. Leah gave a weak nod, but she didn't reach for it. April sighed, tucking her legs beneath her as she sat beside her. She had been the one to intervene, the one to pull Leah from the house before Ryan could do anything else. She had seen everything, heard everything. And now, she was waiting for Leah to speak. Leah swallowed, her throat dry. She should say something. Should explain. Should try to make sense of what had happened. But where would she even begin? Instead, she stared at her hands, focusing on the small silver ring Ryan had given her for their anniversary. It caught the light, gleaming in defiance of the darkness that had settled inside her. Leah, April murmured, her voice gentle but firm. You need to talk to me. You can't just sit there all night. Leah blinked rapidly, as if waking from a trance. She glanced at her friend, taking in the concern written all over her face. He hit me. The words were barely more than a whisper, but they felt like a confession, an admission of something ugly and real. April's hands curled into fists. I know, she said. I saw. A heavy silence stretched between them. Leah's gaze dropped again, settling on her stomach. I'm pregnant. April inhaled sharply. What? I was going to tell him tonight, Leah said numbly. I wanted it to be special. I made his favorite dinner. I wanted to prove to Sylvia that she trailed off, shaking her head. It doesn't matter. The second she whispered in his ear, he changed. I don't even know what she said to him, but suddenly, he was furious. And then, her voice broke. April reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. This wasn't your fault. Leah let out a bitter laugh. I let it get this far. No, April said firmly. Ryan did this. Sylvia did this. Not you. Leah wanted to believe that. But guilt sat heavy in her chest, tangled with fear and regret. Her phone buzzed on the table. Ryan. She flinched, staring at the screen as if it might explode. His name flashed insistently, a cruel reminder of everything she was trying to escape. April grabbed the phone before Leah could react. Don't answer. Leah hesitated. Another buzz. A text this time. Then another. And another. April exhaled sharply and flipped the phone over so Leah couldn't see the messages. He's trying to manipulate you. He sounded scared, Leah murmured, her voice hollow. When he saw the pregnancy test, he looked horrified. Like he couldn't believe what he had just done. Good, April snapped. He should be horrified. He should be ashamed. Leah rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping into her bones. What if he really didn't mean to? April sat up straighter, her expression hardening. Don't. Do not make excuses for him. I'm not. Yes, you are, April cut in. Leah, I know this is hard. But you have to see what's happening here. Ryan isn't just angry. He's dangerous. He put his hands on you while you were pregnant. What happens next time? Leah's stomach churned. Next time. The words sent a shiver down her spine. She thought about the way Ryan had looked at her when she flinched. The horror in his eyes, the way he had reached for her like he wanted to take it back. But he couldn't. Nothing could take it back. Leah covered her face with her hands, her breath coming in uneven gasps. What do I do? April hesitated, then said, You stay here. At least for now. You take time to think. Leah nodded slowly, her fingers pressing into her temples. The phone buzzed again. April sighed and picked it up, glancing at the screen. It's not just Ryan. Leah frowned. What? April turned the phone around, showing her the message. Sylvia. Come home, Leah. This is getting ridiculous. Another message followed. You need to think about your marriage, about your family. Ryan was upset, but he loves you. Don't make this worse than it is. Leah's hands clenched. April scoffed. Of course, she's already trying to control the situation. That woman is toxic. Leah felt something inside her snap. She's the reason this happened. She is, April agreed. But Ryan made the choice to hurt you. Leah swallowed hard, nodding. More messages kept coming. From Ryan. From Sylvia. Desperate, angry, pleading. She wasn't ready to face them. Not yet. April stood and walked to the kitchen, returning with a glass of water. You need to sleep, she said. You need to breathe. I'll turn your phone off. No more messages tonight. Leah exhaled shakily. I don't know if I can sleep. April gave her a sad smile. Try. You're safe here. And you're not alone. Leah let that thought settle, wrapping around her like a fragile shield. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. She placed her hand over her stomach, closing her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she let herself think about the future. And this time, she wasn't thinking about Ryan. Leah lay awake in April's guest room, staring at the ceiling as the faint glow of streetlights bled through the blinds. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ryan's face, his anger, his shock, the way his hand had moved before she even had time to react. She turned onto her side, curling into herself. The silence in April's apartment felt foreign. At home, there was always something: the hum of the fridge, the faint sound of Ryan's footsteps as he moved around, Sylvia's voice in the next room, always present, always critical. Here, the quiet should have been comforting. Instead, it left her alone with her thoughts. How did I let it get this bad? She knew the answer. It wasn't sudden. It had been gradual, a slow erosion of her confidence, her happiness, her sense of self. Ryan hadn't always been this way, had he? No, she remembered a time when he adored her, when he held her like she was the most precious thing in his world. But then Sylvia had moved in, and things had shifted, so subtly at first that Leah barely noticed. She squeezed her eyes shut, memories crashing over her like a tidal wave. Ryan's absences. Leah had always been independent, but she had cherished the time she and Ryan spent together. That changed once Sylvia arrived. The first time Ryan chose his mother over her, it had been small. "We should go out this Friday," Leah had suggested one evening. "Dinner? Maybe a movie?" Ryan had hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I told Mom I'd help her organize her stuff that night." Disappointment had settled in her stomach, but she had brushed it off. It was just one night. Then it became a pattern. Their weekends, once filled with spontaneous trips and lazy mornings in bed, became dictated by Sylvia's needs. She always needed something: help with errands, a ride somewhere, or just company, because she didn't want to be alone. Leah had tried to be understanding. Sylvia had just gone through a painful divorce. But then came the wedding. Her sister's wedding had been one of the most important days of Leah's life. Ryan had promised to be there. She had picked out his suit, made sure his tie matched her dress. But that morning, he had woken up with a sigh. "I don't think I can go," he had said, rubbing his temples as he sat on the edge of the bed. Leah had frozen. "What?" "Mom's upset today," he continued. "She's having a rough time, and I don't feel right leaving her alone." Her hands had clenched into fists. "Ryan, you promised." "I know," he had said, exhaling. "But she's really struggling, Leah. I need to be here for her." That day, she had walked into the wedding alone. Her family had asked where Ryan was, and she had lied, said he was sick, that he hadn't been able to make it. She had smiled through her sister's vows, through the reception, through the speeches. But later that night, alone in the guest room at her parents' house, she had cried. Ryan hadn't even called to check on her. The isolation. At first, Leah hadn't noticed how much she had withdrawn from people. It was gradual, like everything else. Her best friend, Danielle, had once been a constant presence in her life. But after Sylvia moved in, Ryan started making offhand comments. "She's kind of dramatic, don't you think?" he had said one evening after Leah got off the phone with Danielle. "She's always got some crisis going on." Leah had frowned. "She's my best friend." "I know, babe," Ryan had said, kissing her temple. "I just think she stresses you out. Maybe some space would be good." And so, bit by bit, Leah had started making excuses. She canceled plans. She let messages go unanswered. And before long, it wasn't just Danielle, it was everyone. Her world shrank until it consisted of only Ryan and Sylvia. And now, even Ryan was gone. The control. Sylvia had a way of making Leah feel small without ever raising her voice. "Are you sure you want to wear that?" she had asked once, glancing at Leah's dress before a dinner party. Leah had hesitated. "Why?" Sylvia had smiled, sipping her tea. "It's just a little youthful. Maybe something more elegant would be better." It was always subtle, always framed as advice. But after a while, Leah started second-guessing herself. Her clothes, her cooking, the way she arranged the furniture. Ryan had started doing it too. "You don't have to wear makeup every day," he had told her once. "I mean, I like you natural." But then, if she didn't wear makeup, he would say, "Are you feeling okay? You look a little tired." It was a game she could never win. Now, a tear slipped down her cheek as she lay in the dark. April had been right. Ryan hadn't just changed. He had been shaped, molded, influenced. And Leah had let it happen. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She hesitated before reaching for it. "Ryan, please, Leah. Just talk to me." She stared at the words, her heart twisting. He sounded desperate. Then another message. "Sylvia, you're being dramatic. Come home." Her stomach churned. April had warned her that Sylvia would try to twist things to make her feel like she was the one at fault. But Leah knew what had happened. She touched her cheek, the memory of Ryan's slap still fresh. Could she forgive him? Could she trust him again? And even if she did, could she ever live in a home where Sylvia had a say in their marriage? Her fingers hovered over the screen. Then she locked the phone and set it aside. For the first time in years, she wasn't going to respond. Instead, she pulled the blanket over herself, pressing a hand against her stomach. Her child. Her child. This wasn't just about Ryan anymore. It was about the future. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, Leah needed to start thinking about herself. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and faintly of lavender, the scent likely from the artificial air fresheners plugged into the walls. Leah sat in the corner, her fingers laced together in her lap, her stomach tight with nerves. She had barely slept the night before. Her thoughts had chased themselves in circles, caught between the memory of Ryan's face, shocked, horrified, desperate, and the quiet determination she had found in herself as she decided, I won't go back. This morning, she had gotten up before April, slipping out of the apartment and making her way to the clinic alone. She hadn't even been sure she was ready to take this step, but as she sat here now, the reality of it settled over her. Her first prenatal appointment. A nurse called her name, and Leah stood, smoothing her hands down her sweater as she followed the woman down a quiet hallway. The walls were lined with framed photos of newborns, tiny footprints inked onto birth certificates. A reminder of what was ahead. The exam room was cool, the paper sheet crinkling beneath her as she settled onto the table. A few minutes later, the doctor entered, a warm smile on her face. Leah, it's nice to meet you. I'm Dr. Castillo. How are you feeling? Leah hesitated. How is she feeling? Honestly, she said, forcing a small smile. A little overwhelmed. Dr. Castillo nodded as she flipped through Leah's chart. That's completely normal. Pregnancy is a big change. But we'll take everything one step at a time, okay? Leah swallowed hard and nodded. According to your last cycle, you should be about 8 weeks along, the doctor continued. We'll confirm everything with an ultrasound today. Are you ready? Was she? She had spent the past 24 hours consumed by the chaos of leaving Ryan, of dodging his messages, of trying to convince herself she was strong enough to do this alone. She hadn't had time to stop and think about what this moment would mean. But now, as she lay back and the doctor spread cool gel over her stomach, it all became real. A few clicks, the gentle whir of the machine, and then a sound filled the room. Steady, strong, rhythmic. Leah sucked in a breath, her chest tightening. Her baby's heartbeat. She had seen pregnancy tests before. Imagined what it would be like to be a mother. But nothing had prepared her for this, the sound of life echoing in the small, sterile room. Tears blurred her vision. There's your baby, Dr. Castillo said gently, turning the screen toward Leah. And there it was. A tiny form, barely more than a shadow, but there. Real. A tear slipped down Leah's cheek. She hadn't cried when she left Ryan's house. She hadn't cried when she ignored Sylvia's messages, when she turned off her phone to silence the relentless calls. But now, hearing this tiny heartbeat, she couldn't stop herself. Because this wasn't about Ryan. This wasn't about Sylvia. It was about this. About the tiny heartbeat inside her, about the future she had yet to figure out, about the love she already felt swelling in her chest. You okay? Dr. Castillo asked. Leah nodded, wiping at her eyes. Yeah. I didn't expect it to feel like this. The doctor smiled. That's completely normal. It's a big moment. Leah swallowed hard and whispered, Can I record it? Dr. Castillo nodded. Of course. With shaky fingers, Leah pulled out her phone and pressed record. The sound filled the device, the steady rhythm of life that was now her responsibility. And as she listened, she made a decision. She sent it to Ryan. A message sent, a response awaited. Back at April's apartment, Leah sat curled up on the couch, staring at her phone. She had sent the recording without a message, without an explanation. Just the sound of their child's heartbeat. Ryan hadn't responded. She wasn't sure if that relieved her or made her more anxious. What are you thinking? April asked, sitting beside her with 2 mugs of tea. Leah shook her head. I don't know. April sipped her tea before setting it down. I think you do. Leah exhaled. I don't know if I want him to respond or if I want to pretend he doesn't exist. April leaned back against the couch. That makes sense. Silence stretched between them, comfortable but heavy. Leah wrapped her fingers around the warmth of the mug, grounding herself in the small comforts. Then her phone buzzed. She sucked in a breath. Ryan. Her fingers trembled as she opened the message. Ryan, Leah. I don't have words. Please, let me see you. She stared at the screen, her emotions a tangled mess. She hadn't expected him to brush it off. Hadn't expected him to be indifferent. But seeing his response, knowing he was sitting somewhere listening to their child's heartbeat, shook her in ways she wasn't prepared for. April leaned over, reading the message. And what do you want to do? Leah hesitated. She didn't trust Ryan. Not after everything. But she had loved him once. She had built a life with him. And part of her needed to know if this changed anything. I'll meet him, she said finally. But on my terms. April frowned. Are you sure? Leah nodded. I need to hear what he has to say. The coffee shop. The air was thick with the scent of roasted espresso beans as Leah stepped into the small cafe. The same cafe where she had met Ryan. It felt strange to be here again, standing in the place where their love had begun, now weighed down by everything they had become. Ryan was already there, sitting at the table where they had once shared their first conversation. He looked different. Disheveled. Tired. His eyes snapped up the moment she walked in, and for a second, he just stared. Then he stood abruptly, as if unsure what to do. Leah, he breathed. She hesitated before sitting across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ryan pulled out his phone and pressed a button. The sound of the heartbeat filled the space between them. Leah swallowed hard. That's our baby, Ryan said, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded. I can't believe. He trailed off, shaking his head. His hands were trembling. God, Leah. I hurt you. His voice broke. Leah flinched, the memory of his hands still fresh. He saw it. And it wrecked him. I don't expect you to forgive me, he whispered. I don't even forgive myself. Silence. Leah folded her hands together. Then why are we here? Ryan swallowed hard. Because I want to be better. I want to fix this. Her throat tightened. I don't know if you can. Ryan's gaze didn't waver. Let me try. Leah looked down at her stomach. For their child's sake, she needed to hear him out. But she wasn't going to make it easy. Not anymore. Ryan looked different, weary, like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, the faint stubble on his jaw a stark contrast to the polished, put-together man Leah had married. His hands, resting on the table between them, trembled slightly. But it was his eyes that struck her the most. She had seen regret in them before, small moments after an argument, when he knew he had been too harsh, too distant. But this was guilt, raw and unfiltered. She kept her posture stiff, her arms folded as she leveled him with a steady gaze. Say what you need to say. Ryan exhaled, his fingers flexing as he struggled for words. Leah, he stopped, shaking his head. He tried again. I don't know where to start. The truth, she said flatly. A shadow crossed his face. He nodded, swallowing hard before he spoke. Sylvia lied to me. Leah felt her muscles tighten. About what? Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders sagging. She told me you were having an affair. His voice was hoarse, weighted with something Leah couldn't yet name. She said she overheard you on the phone, that you were planning to leave me for someone else. Leah's heart clenched in disbelief. You believe that? Ryan flinched. I didn't want to, Leah. But she had all these little details, these things that he let out a breath. She made it make sense. She played into every insecurity I already had. Leah shook her head, heat rising in her chest. So that's what she whispered to you that night? That I was cheating? Ryan nodded, shame evident in the way he wouldn't meet her gaze. And I snapped. Leah closed her eyes briefly, her jaw tightening. She could still feel the sting of his palm against her skin, the shock that had rippled through her when it happened. "And what, Ryan?" Her voice was sharp now, laced with bitterness. "If I had been cheating, that would have justified hitting me?" Ryan sucked in a sharp breath, his face contorting. "No," he shook his head violently. "No, God, Leah, nothing justifies that. I don't know what happened to me. I let my anger take over. I let her words take over." His voice cracked. "I became him." Leah stilled. Him. She knew who he meant. Ryan's father. Her breath hitched slightly, but she forced herself to remain impassive. "You always said you would never be like him." "I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "And that night I proved myself wrong." Silence stretched between them. The weight of his confession, the truth of it, settled into Leah's chest like a stone. Finally, she spoke. "So what now?" Ryan sat up straighter, a look of determination hardening his features. "I started therapy." Leah blinked. "You, what?" "I started going after you left," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "I needed to understand how I let myself get to that point. I needed to understand how she had so much control over me." Leah hesitated. "And what did you figure out?" Ryan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "That I've been letting my mother run my life since I was a kid. That I grew up watching my father hurt her, and instead of realizing she was a victim, I made her my world. I thought if I kept her happy, I wouldn't be like him. But I was never just her son, Leah. I was her crutch, her emotional caretaker, her pawn." His hands curled into fists. "She convinced me that you were the enemy. She convinced me that you were taking me away from her. And I let her." Leah took a slow breath. She had always known that Sylvia had too much influence over Ryan, but hearing him finally admit it, was like watching a wall crumble. He wasn't just sorry. He was reckoning with the truth. Still, apologies weren't enough. "And what happens when she comes back?" she asked. "Because she will, Ryan. She'll find a way to twist this. She'll cry and make you feel guilty and—" "She won't," Ryan interrupted, his jaw clenching. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded document, and placed it on the table. "I filed a restraining order against her." Leah's eyes widened. "What?" "She doesn't know yet," he admitted. "But my lawyer does. If she tries to come near you, near the baby, she'll be legally blocked from contacting us." "Us." The word was careful, tentative. Leah hesitated before reaching for the document, scanning the legal terms. It was real. He had actually done it. "You're really cutting her off," she murmured, stunned. Ryan's throat worked as he nodded. "I have to." He hesitated, then added, "For you. For our baby. And for myself." Leah inhaled deeply, setting the paper down. This was more than she had expected. But it still wasn't enough. "And what about us?" she asked. Ryan's expression turned raw. Vulnerable. "I know I don't deserve you," he admitted. "And I don't expect you to take me back. But I need you to know that I'm not going to stop fighting for this family." He pulled out a second document, sliding it toward her. She picked it up cautiously. The words at the top made her breath catch. Custody agreement. Her eyes flicked to his in confusion. "If I ever hurt you again," Ryan said, his voice steady, "if I ever make you feel unsafe, I waive all rights. You will have full custody of our child. No legal battle, no fight." Leah's hands trembled slightly as she processed the weight of it. This wasn't just a promise. This was a contract. She looked up at him, searching his face. "You're really willing to put this in writing?" Ryan's gaze was unwavering. "Yes." Leah let out a shaky breath. For so long, she had felt trapped, suffocated by a marriage that had slowly become unrecognizable. And now, Ryan was laying everything out before her, proof of his remorse, proof of his willingness to change. But was it enough? She didn't know. Not yet. She carefully set the papers aside, meeting his gaze. "I need time." Ryan nodded, exhaling slowly, as if he had been holding his breath. "Take all the time you need." A long pause. Then, softly, he said, "May I still be there for the baby?" Leah hesitated, then gave a small nod. "We'll take it one step at a time." Relief flickered in his eyes. That's all I can ask for. Leah looked down at her stomach, the weight of everything pressing into her, but for the first time in a long time, there was space to breathe. No promises. No guarantees. Just the slow, careful steps towards something new. Leah had expected Sylvia's reaction to be bad. She hadn't expected it to be this bad. It started with the calls, dozens of them. Leah had turned her phone back on after leaving the coffee shop, wanting to think, to process everything Ryan had told her. But within minutes, Sylvia's name flashed on the screen. Over and over again. Leah ignored the first few, but the messages started pouring in. Sylvia, you ungrateful little girl. Sylvia, I raised him better than this. You're poisoning him against his own mother. Sylvia, you won't win. Leah stared at the messages, her heart pounding. Sylvia was losing control of Ryan, and she knew it. And now she was directing all her fury at Leah. She should have expected that. She set the phone down, pressing her hands to her face. April walked in, taking one look at her and immediately tensing. What happened? Leah sighed, rubbing her temples. Sylvia knows. April's jaw clenched. And? Leah slid the phone toward her. April picked it up, scrolling through the messages, her expression darkening with every word. She's unhinged, April muttered. And she's obsessed with controlling him. Leah exhaled. I know. April set the phone down with a sharp tap. You need to block her. Leah hesitated. I mean it, Leah, April pressed. She's escalating. She's going to make your life hell if you let her. Leah bit her lip, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sweater. Blocking her won't make her stop. No, but it'll make it harder for her to get to you, April said. And you need space. Leah swallowed hard. She reached for the phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then, with a deep breath, she blocked Sylvia's number. A small thing. But it felt huge. Sylvia's escalation. But Sylvia wasn't done. The next day, she showed up at Leah's workplace. Leah had been in the middle of teaching when the office assistant knocked on the classroom door, whispering that someone was asking to see her. Leah's stomach dropped. She stepped outside, and there, standing in the hallway like a storm brewing, was Sylvia. Her face was tight with barely restrained fury, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked Leah up and down, her eyes flickering briefly to her stomach before settling into a scowl. You think you can just cut me out? Sylvia hissed. Leah crossed her arms, keeping her posture firm even as her heart pounded. I think I can choose who I want in my life. And in my child's life. Sylvia let out a sharp laugh, low and bitter. You really believe Ryan will stay away from me? From his own mother. Leah took a slow breath. Ryan made his choice. Sylvia's eyes burned with anger. You've brainwashed him. You've turned him against me. Leah clenched her jaw. I didn't turn him against you, Sylvia. You did that all by yourself. Sylvia's face twisted, her hands balling into fists. You'll regret this, Leah. A wave of cold fear ran down Leah's spine, but she didn't let it show. You need to leave, she said firmly. Now. Or I'll call security. Sylvia held her glare for a moment longer, then scoffed. This isn't over. She turned on her heel and stalked off, leaving Leah standing there, pulse hammering. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ryan's breaking point. Later that evening, Leah sat in April's apartment, recounting everything to Ryan over the phone. Ryan had been silent the whole time, listening. But when she told him about Sylvia showing up at her workplace, his breathing changed. Sharp. Controlled. Furious. She came to your job? He asked, his voice deadly calm. Yes, Leah said, keeping her voice steady. Ryan, she's spiraling. Silence. Then Ryan said, she thinks she can still control me. Leah swallowed. Can she? Ryan exhaled. No. For the first time, she believed him. I'm filing the restraining order, Ryan said, his voice unwavering. It's already in motion, but after this? I'm making sure she can't come near you or the baby. Leah closed her eyes, relief washing over her. Thank you. I'm sorry she's doing this, Ryan said. I'm sorry for everything. Leah took a breath, steadying herself. We'll figure it out. They had to. Sylvia's last attempt. But Sylvia wasn't done fighting. A few days later, Leah got a call from her boss. Leah, Principal Manning said, his tone concerned, I need to ask, are you okay? Leah frowned. What do you mean? There was a pause. Then, softly, someone's been spreading rumors about you. Leah's stomach dropped. What kind of rumors? Principal Manning hesitated, then said, that you're an unfit teacher. That you have personal issues that could affect your work. Leah's breath caught. Sylvia. It had to be her. She came here, Leah whispered. She's trying to ruin my life. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then, Leah, I want you to know that I don't believe any of it. And neither do your coworkers. You're a great teacher. Leah closed her eyes, her throat tightening. Thank you. But, Principal Manning added, if she keeps showing up, I'll have to escalate this. We can't have disruptions at the school. I understand, Leah said, her voice barely steady. I'm handling it. And she would. She was done letting Sylvia control her life. The final cut. That night, Leah met Ryan again this time to sign the final restraining order. They sat together in his car outside the courthouse, the paperwork between them. I never thought I'd do this, Ryan admitted, staring down at the papers. Cutting her out. Leah watched him carefully. Are you having second thoughts? Ryan met her gaze, his eyes dark but certain. No. I should have done it a long time ago. Leah nodded. Ryan picked up the pen, pressing it to the paper. He hesitated for only a second before signing his name in bold, clear ink. And just like that, Sylvia was legally removed from their lives. Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It's over. Leah nodded. Yeah. For the first time in years, she felt free. Sylvia had tried to manipulate, control, and break her. But in the end, she had lost. And Leah? She was finally ready to start over. Leah hesitated in front of the door to Ryan's house, her house, or at least it used to be. The place that had once been her sanctuary now felt foreign, like stepping into a memory she wasn't sure she wanted to relive. She wasn't here to move back in. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But Ryan had asked her to come by so they could talk about what came next, about co-parenting, about everything. And after all the steps he had taken, the restraining order, therapy, cutting Sylvia out of his life, she owed him that conversation. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Then, before she could change her mind, she pushed it open. The house was quiet. No Sylvia. No tension crackling in the air like it used to. Just Ryan, standing in the kitchen, staring at the dinner table like he didn't quite know what to do with himself. When he saw her, his face softened. Hey, Leah swallowed. Hey. A long pause stretched between them before Ryan cleared his throat. I made dinner. He gestured toward the table, where 2 plates Saturday. I wasn't sure what you've been craving lately, so I made a few things. Leah glanced at the spread. Grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes. Simple. Familiar. He remembered what she liked. Her chest tightened. Thanks, she murmured, sitting down. Ryan followed suit, his hands clasped together. Silence settled between them. It wasn't awkward, exactly, but it was heavy. So much had happened, so much had been broken, and neither of them knew how to start again. Finally, Ryan sighed. I know this doesn't fix anything. Leah set down her fork. No, it doesn't. He nodded, as if he had expected that. I want you to know that I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. Or at all. He looked up, eyes earnest. I just want to be better for you, for the baby. Leah studied him. For years, she had wanted to hear those words. She had begged for Ryan to stand up to Sylvia, to take responsibility, to choose her. And now, when it mattered most, he was. But was it too late? She exhaled. I don't know what happens next, Ryan. I know. He hesitated. But I do know that I love you. That hasn't changed. Leah's chest ached. She had loved him too. So much. But love wasn't always enough. She placed a hand on her stomach, grounding herself. I need to trust you again. Ryan nodded, swallowing hard. Then I'll earn it. However long it takes. Leah held his gaze. For the first time in a long time, she believed him. Building boundaries. The next few weeks were a slow, careful rebuilding. Leah didn't move back in, but she and Ryan started spending more time together. Doctor's appointments, preparing the nursery, small moments where they learned how to be around each other again without the weight of Sylvia's influence pressing down on them. Ryan continued therapy, sharing pieces of his progress when Leah was willing to listen. I never realized how much of my life revolved around her, he admitted one evening, as they sat on the porch after her latest checkup. She made me feel like I had to choose, her or you. And I let her convince me that choosing her was the only way to prove I wasn't like my father. Leah watched him carefully. And now, Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Now I see how wrong that was. How much I hurt you because of it. Leah's fingers curled around the edge of her sweater. She had spent so long waiting for him to see it, and now that he finally did, she wasn't sure if it changed everything or if it just made what they had lost hurt more. The nursery. One afternoon, Leah stood in what had once been Sylvia's bedroom. Now it was empty, ready for a fresh start. Ryan had painted the walls a soft lavender, the color Leah had once mentioned in passing when they talked about what a nursery might look like. She hadn't expected him to remember. But as she stood there, taking in the space that would soon belong to their daughter, a lump formed in her throat. Ryan entered the room behind her, rubbing the back of his neck. I wasn't sure if you'd like it. Leah turned, meeting his gaze. I do. His shoulders sagged slightly in relief. Then, softly, he asked, do you think you'll move back in? Leah's breath caught. For weeks, Ryan hadn't pressured her. He had given her space, respected her boundaries. But now, standing here, she knew he was asking because he was hoping. She hesitated, pressing a hand to her stomach. I don't know, she admitted. But this is a start. Ryan nodded. That's all I can ask for. A glimpse of hope. The ultrasound appointment felt different this time. Not just because Ryan was there, but because Leah felt lighter. For the first time since this pregnancy began, she didn't feel completely alone. The moment the image of their baby appeared on the screen, Ryan sucked in a breath. Wow. Leah's lips parted. The doctor smiled. It's a girl. Leah let out a soft laugh, her chest tightening. A daughter. Ryan ran a hand over his face, his eyes suspiciously bright. A little girl, he murmured. I can't believe it! Leah felt the weight of that statement. She thought about Ryan's past, about the father he had grown up with, about Sylvia's grip on him. Then she looked at him now, choosing different, choosing to break the cycle. Do you want to feel her? She asked softly. Ryan hesitated, then nodded. She took his hand, placing it gently on her stomach. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a small flutter. Ryan inhaled sharply. Was that? Leah smiled. Yeah. His fingers tightened slightly against her belly, his expression filled with something she couldn't quite name. Love. Fear. Hope. I won't let her grow up the way I did, Ryan whispered. I promise. Leah studied him, searching for doubt. She didn't find any. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about fixing what they had. Maybe it was about building something new. For her. For them. For their daughter. Leah sat in the nursery, rocking slowly in the chair Ryan had built for her. The past few weeks had been different. The air between them no longer carried the sharpness of past wounds, but there was still a cautiousness in every step forward. She wasn't moving back and not yet. She had made that clear. But she had been here more often, helping set up the baby's room, planning for her arrival, and having long, careful conversations with Ryan about what came next. For the first time, Leah allowed herself to imagine a future where Ryan was the man he was trying to become, where their daughter would grow up in a home free of anger, control, and manipulation. She wanted to believe it was possible. But trust was a fragile thing, and she wasn't sure if hers would ever fully recover. Ryan appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets. You look comfortable. Leah glanced up, offering a small smile. I am. She's going to love this room. Ryan hesitated. We did good. Leah's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest of the chair. The way he said we made something in her chest ache. She nodded. Yeah. Ryan took a slow breath, then stepped inside, sitting down on the carpeted floor. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, surrounded by soft lavender walls, a white crib, and shelves waiting to be filled with bedtime stories. Then Ryan broke the silence. I think about it every day, he admitted, staring at the floor. The night I hit you. Leah's fingers curled into her lap. Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I wake up, and it's the first thing in my head. And at night, it's the last thing I see before I fall asleep. His voice wavered. It was the worst moment of my life, Leah. And I hate that it was your worst moment, too. Leah swallowed hard. It was. Ryan flinched. But he nodded, accepting her words. I won't ever ask you to forget it. I need you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life making sure it never happens again. Leah studied him carefully. The old Ryan, the man she fell in love with, had always been charming, easygoing, full of promise. This Ryan? He looked worn, like he had fought a war inside himself and come out the other side. And for the first time, he wasn't making excuses. He wasn't blaming Sylvia or stress or the past. He was simply owning it. Leah let out a slow breath. I know you're trying. Ryan nodded. I am. A silence stretched between them. Then Leah said, I'm still scared. Ryan's throat bobbed. I know. Leah looked down at her stomach, smoothing her hands over the swell of her growing child. I need to trust that you won't just be a better man for me, but for her too. Ryan sat up straighter, his expression firm. She'll never know the man I was that night. I won't let that be the father she grows up with. Leah held his gaze. I hope so. And for the first time, she actually meant it. A new normal. The next few weeks passed in a slow, careful rhythm. Leah and Ryan attended birthing classes together, sat side by side in waiting rooms, and made quiet, tentative plans for the future. Ryan was cautious with her, never pushing, never demanding. And Leah? She found herself allowing small pieces of warmth to return. One evening, Ryan drove her home after a late appointment. He parked outside April's apartment, but before she could get out, he hesitated. Can I ask you something? He said. Leah shifted in her seat. Go ahead. Ryan's fingers tapped against the steering wheel. If things had been different, if I had never let Sylvia control our lives, if I had never hurt you, do you think we'd still be happy? Leah's heart clenched. If. That word held so much weight. She turned to him, meeting his gaze. I think we'd be different. Ryan swallowed. Is different better? Leah sighed, looking out the window. The city lights blurred in the distance. I don't know. Ryan nodded, exhaling softly. That's fair. Leah hesitated, then reached out, just for a second, placing her hand over his. A small reassurance. A quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come. Then she pulled away, stepping out of the car. Ryan didn't try to stop her. He simply watched as she disappeared inside, accepting that some things couldn't be rushed. The ultrasound that changed everything. Leah's final ultrasound appointment before the baby's arrival felt different. This time, she wasn't just seeing their child. She was making a decision. Ryan sat beside her, gripping the armrest as the doctor moved the probe over her belly. The screen flickered, and then, there she was. Their daughter. Leah inhaled sharply, tears burning in her eyes. She's so big. Ryan let out a shaky laugh. She looks real now. Leah turned to him. She was always real. Ryan met her gaze, his throat bobbing. I know. But now, it's like, I can see her. And all I can think about is, I need to get this right. Leah felt something shift inside her. She had spent so much time trying to protect herself, to make sure she wasn't walking back into the same nightmare. But Ryan wasn't just saying the right words anymore. He was living them. And maybe that meant something. One step forward. That night, Leah sat in the nursery again, letting the soft scent of lavender and fresh paint surround her. April's apartment was safe, but this was home. She traced a finger along the crib's wooden frame, breathing in the quiet. She didn't hear Ryan come in, but she felt him standing just behind her, waiting. Leah turned. And then, softly, she said, "I want to come home." Ryan's breath caught. His hands trembled at his sides. "Are you sure?" Leah nodded, placing a hand over her stomach. "Not because of the past. Not because I miss the old us. But because I believe in the person you're becoming. And I want our daughter to see that man." Ryan let out a slow, unsteady breath. Then, with cautious, careful, overwhelming gratitude, he whispered, "Thank you." Leah wasn't naive. She knew trust took time. But tonight, as she stood in the nursery, the heart of their future, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something better. Leah clutched Ryan's hand as another contraction tore through her, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The hospital room was too bright, too cold, too real. Everything had been happening so fast, yet it also felt like time was dragging, stretching between each contraction, between each deep breath, between each moment that brought her closer to meeting their daughter. Ryan squeezed her fingers. "You're doing amazing," he whispered. Leah barely had the energy to glare at him. "Don't." She panted, "Say things you can't possibly understand." Ryan bit back a smile, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "Okay, then I'll just sit here and try not to get my hand crushed." Leah exhaled, pressing her head back against the pillow. This was happening. There was no going back. The reality of it settled into her bones, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. A nurse appeared at her side, adjusting the fore and monitoring the baby's heart rate. "You're progressing beautifully," she said. "A few more centimeters, and it'll be time to push." Leah groaned. "A few more?" The nurse chuckled. "You're almost there, sweetheart. You've got this." Ryan leaned in, his lips brushing her knuckles. "I am so proud of you." Leah swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She was too exhausted to analyze how much those words meant coming from him, but deep down, she knew. He was here. He had stayed. He had changed. And despite everything, she wanted to believe it. Another contraction hit, and Leah gritted her teeth, gripping Ryan's hand so tightly she heard his breath hitch. "I swear," she gasped, "I'm never doing this again." Ryan let out a soft chuckle. "Fair." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying just how emotional he really was. The moment everything changed. Time blurred after that. Pain, pressure, the sharp instructions of the doctor, "Push, Leah, push," and the unrelenting grip of Ryan's hands anchoring her through every second of it. Then, suddenly, a cry. A sharp, piercing wail that filled the room, drowning out everything else. Leah's body sagged against the bed, shaking, trembling, exhausted. But when she looked up and saw the nurse lifting a tiny, squirming baby into the air, all the pain disappeared. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the nurse gently placed their daughter against her chest. Warm, small, fragile. Leah stared down at her, unable to breathe. She's so perfect." Ryan made a strangled sound beside her, his hands hovering, shaking, as if he was afraid to touch either of them. But when he finally reached out, running the tip of his finger down their daughter's tiny hand, his whole body shuddered. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She's so, God, Leah, she's real." Leah let out a soft, breathless laugh. She was always real. Ryan nodded, his eyes glistening. "I know. But now, I can see her." Their daughter's tiny fingers curled around his, gripping onto him like she already knew who he was. Ryan let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to his mouth as he lost the battle against his tears. And in that moment, Leah saw him, really saw him. Not the man who had failed her before. Not the man who had let his mother control his life. But the man he was becoming. The father he was ready to be. The final test. Leah was still in the hospital when Sylvia showed up. April had been the one to warn them. She had overheard a nurse talking, had seen Sylvia in the hallway demanding to see her granddaughter. Ryan tensed immediately. "I'll handle it." Leah hesitated, glancing down at their sleeping baby. "Ryan." He turned to her, something firm and unshakable in his gaze. "I mean it, Leah. You don't need to deal with this. Not anymore." Leah exhaled, searching his face. And then, slowly, she nodded. Ryan kissed her forehead, then turned and strode out of the room. The final confrontation. Sylvia was waiting near the nurse's station, arms crossed, eyes blazing. Ryan hadn't seen her in weeks, not since the restraining order had been filed. But she was still his mother, and some part of him had always expected her to try one last time. "Ryan." Her voice was sharp. "I want to see my granddaughter." Ryan didn't waver. "No." Sylvia's nostrils flared. "Excuse me?" Ryan stood taller, his voice even. Unshakable. "You lost the right to be part of my family when you tried to destroy it." Sylvia let out a breathless laugh. "You can't be serious." Ryan didn't blink. "I've never been more serious in my life." For the first time, Sylvia looked uncertain. She searched his face, her bravado faltering. "Ryan, I'm your mother." "You were supposed to be," Ryan said quietly. "But you chose control over love. You chose to manipulate instead of support me. And you tried to ruin my marriage because you couldn't stand the idea of me having something that wasn't yours." Sylvia's jaw clenched. "She turned you against me." Ryan shook his head. "You did that yourself." Sylvia stepped forward, her eyes dark and desperate. "Ryan, please." He took a step back. A physical, deliberate barrier. And then, calmly, he said, "Goodbye, Mom." Sylvia's face crumbled. "You're making a mistake." Ryan took a slow breath. "No," he said. "For the first time in my life. I'm not." He turned and walked away, leaving Sylvia standing there, frozen in the past while he finally stepped into his future. A new beginning. When Ryan re-entered the hospital room, he let out a long, unsteady breath. "It's done," he murmured. "She's gone." Leah studied him carefully. "How do you feel?" Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Like I just closed the last door I should have closed a long time ago." Leah nodded, watching as he walked over to the hospital bed and gazed down at their daughter. She was awake now, blinking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Ryan let out a soft laugh, brushing a finger across her cheek. "Hi, baby girl," he whispered. "It's just us now." Leah felt something shift in her chest. Maybe she and Ryan would never be the same. Maybe their marriage would always carry the weight of what had happened. But as she watched him hold their daughter for the first time, saw the way he looked at her like she was his entire world, she realized that they weren't meant to go back. They were meant to build something new. Leah reached out, wrapping her fingers around Ryan's wrist. He looked at her, hopeful, vulnerable, ready. And for the first time, Leah let herself believe in him again. Because in the end, he had chosen her. And this time, he wasn't letting go.